Jumpin' In on Manx Radio.
With Howard and Chris Kane.
Hello.
Good evening.
And welcome. And here we are once again. Yes, indeed. It is Friday night, not Crackerjack, although we still miss it and haven't got any jazz pencils yet.
Not a bad
but
idea, though.
It's a very good idea. Anyway, it is in the meantime Jumping In. Best in modern and contemporary jazz, of course, here on Manx Radio with myself, H.
And me, Chris. Yes, welcome along to this week's show. And along with some music, some new music, we've got a couple of debut discs, but we also say goodbye to not one but three greats this week. Fortunately, they all have more than performed during their time and leave great recorded legacies, but more on which later on. So, H, what have you been listening to as your treat as you casually dip your apples in toffee, and what's left you burning the cinder toffee as a trick this week?
Well, one great who's still with us happily and playing at the top of his game, the great Charles Lloyd, out with another double album, Figure in Blue. Been enjoying that the last week or so. We'll be sampling a little bit of that. We'll be out of into some great stuff coming out of Blue Note again, the second album from this sort of super group, as it were, and as you mentioned, celebrating the life of the great bassist Anthony Jackson.
And from me, well, we give you the finger. We have a wild finger on the loose. We rediscover for the first time, and we look through our passports. But to get us underway, time takes odd turns with Note 1 from the Tom Johnson Jazz Orchestra. Nice indeed. Tom Johnson's Jazz Orchestra. Dr. Tom Johnson might not be a familiar name to you, but perhaps he is that rare thing, a jazz musician who pursued an academic and profitable profession as a psychologist, lecturer and author for over 40 years, whilst never losing his love of music and continuing to study the trombone and composition before finally getting together a collection of scores written over the whole of that period and a fine 20-piece big band made up of friends, students and the best of the Indiana jazz scene to record his debut album Time Takes Odd Turns, from which we heard Naught One. Tom has now finally retired from his professional duties and can give his full attention to jazz. As he says, I really enjoyed my academic work, but my true love has always been the music.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a great link between education and jazz and music. It still goes hand in glove. And the number of musicians, particularly younger musicians, but I'm saying that, even the sort of older ones as well, like Alan and people we've met at various festivals over the years who play a lot, and then in between they're teaching all the time. They're teaching in conservatoires, they're teaching in colleges, they're teaching in colleges for further education, they're doing private pupils, and it's sort of a hand-in-glove thing. It's a hard old life working as a freelance musician, it has to be said. A man who's been doing that for a long time now is Charles Lloyd. 87 years old he is now, and as I say, we sadly see people popping off to the bandstand in the sky. Charles Lloyd still very much with us and still playing very much at the top of his game. Last year he brought out the trio of trios, and this year he's now done a one trio but a double album. I think he's getting it all out there. He says he's got a lot to say still and he wants to get it out while he can. I think Figure in Blue is out on Blue Note, and it features his trio with Jason Moran on piano and shakers, I see it's noticed as well, and Marvin Sewell, guitarist he's played with for quite some time. Been enjoying this one as a late night listening to over dinner last night, in fact. And let's, from disc 2, let's hear a bit of Heaven. Lovely stuff, laid back, lush, that usual flittering featherlight sound that he has, and ornamentations, and it is becoming more and more spiritual, I think, his music, as is Charles himself. But as we were just chatting, as we were listening to that, the bottom line is he's still at 87, going strong, playing brilliantly, whereas an awful lot of his contemporaries at the time are no longer necessarily with us. Having, as we said, he dropped out of the scene in the 60s, hippie scene, where there was an awful lot of drugs going on and booze and sort of excess living, and he decided, no, he quit the whole scene and went out and meditated in Big Sur in California for several years, and came back. I think when Michel Petrucciani came onto the scene, he was very much inspired by Michel, and came back in the 1980s and had a whole second career again. Wonderful latest one on Blue Note, which are having a very much Blue Note are having a bit of a golden or a purple patch at the moment, if you'll excuse the pun, bringing out some cracking music. And this is, like I said, a double CD from Charles, his latest. He seems to be bringing out at least 2 or 3 every year. Figure in Blue, Jason Moran with a wonderful piano there, Marvin Sewell with very sympathetic guitar, and that track Heaven, composed by, of course, Duke Ellington. Lovely.
Indeed. Duke Ellington, one of the most prolific composers on the planet. And should you find yourself heading towards the London Jazz Festival in a few weeks, as we will be, then pop into the Jazz Social, where there will be a Blue Note pop-up store again.
Yeah, just make sure that you get there early, because if there's someone playing, it gets really busy.
Yes, I mean, too busy to physically turn round, let alone swing a cat. Yes. And he always has that fragility, Charles Lloyd. Reminds me of Miles to a certain extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Regard. Fragile is another good word for him.
Now, next for me, as many of you you may have been saddened as I was to hear of the recent death of the extraordinary bassist Danny Thompson, aged 86. He was the man who brought jazz to British folk as the founder of Pentangle in the 60s, folk supergroup with Jackie McGee, John Renbourn, Bert Jansch and Terry Cox. I noticed Bert Jansch was actually put forward for one of the Mercury Prizes, bringing together folk, jazz and blues as well. He was versed in spending time in the 60s with Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated. He collaborated for a long time with John Martin on the road, Nick Drake, June Tabor, Cliff Richard, Johnny Hates Jazz, ironically, Rod Stewart, T-Rex, ABC, everything but the girl, as I say, including Kate Bush, David Sylvan, Talk Duck, and early sessions with Tubby Hayes and John McLaughlin. And then his own band Whatever, recording just 3 releases starting as late as 1987. They mixed everything he loves with an eclectic cast, including, on the third one, Stan Tracy. But from his second, entitled Whatever Next, here's Wildfinger. The wonderful Danny Thompson on bass with Wildfinger, a track he wrote for his friend and fellow wild man John Martin. The pair were known for their excess and partying. In fact, the two of them formed what the writer Mark Cooper called a notorious double act as they slurred their way between sentimental tenderness and barely camouflaged rage. By the late 70s, unfortunately, the drinking had taken its toll, and it took nearly a decade for him to overcome those particular devils before releasing his solo albums in the 80s. But on that track, we heard Bernie Holland on guitar, Tony Roberts on assorted reeds, a wonderful sax solo from Paul Dunbar, and of course, Danny Thompson with that wonderful mellifluous double bass sound that he made his own.
He did, and cracking sound there. Again, you sort of had those folk influences. Brilliant bass player. I do remember seeing him at the Jazz Cafe supporting Sidsel Endresen many years ago. And I'm trying to think whether it's who he was playing with. It was a small group, in any case, a trio or a quartet. And fine bass player. Very adept at playing in different styles, like I said, and is renowned in the folk world as he is in playing in the jazz world. Another sort of luminary from the jazz world, not as far as I'm aware that active in folk, but certainly a pioneer of his instrument, Anthony Jackson, described as the low-end legend who pioneered the concept of the modern six-string bass. I'm afraid we've lost him, just passed away recently at the age of 73. A tribute's being led by Al Di Meola, amongst others. Played with, well, again, who didn't he play with? So many. A session legend as well, and like I said, was seen as pioneering this. If you saw him playing at this six string, it looked sort of, you thought, what's going on there? And you think, oh gosh, yeah, there's an extra two strings on top. And my word, could he get around them all as well. It always seemed to be a quiet, intensely sort of personal sort of man, not flashy on stage. I never remember him speaking really. He'd just come on and he just played his instrument and spoke through the music and didn't seem to want to do a great deal more than that. We did see him on a few occasions, and I was looking at, well, several albums we could have played, but this one I remember we saw him playing, supporting this album, Michel Petrucciani, Steve Gadd and Anthony Jackson, and we saw him in, I think it was Brecon Jazz Festival, if it serves correct. Wonderful, on a packed market hall at Brecon, 20 or 30 years ago, I guess. And just looking at the album, this was 1999, that would sound about right. 26 years, that would be round about there. But this was a little bit further afield, and this is a track called Training.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Blue Note Tokyo. Now, please welcome the Michel Petrucciani Trio, featuring Steve Gadd and Anthony Jackson.
Michel Petrucciani Trio live at the Blue Note in Tokyo in 1999. I'm saying that, it might actually be, no, I tell a lie, 1997 that was actually recorded. God, see, time flies, doesn't it? With Michel, of course, sadly no longer with us. Steve Gadd, who happily is and still playing well. Anthony Jackson on the bass, on the 6-string electric bass, and the instrument he made its own with those fluid lines, nimble fingers, and like I said, just sort of fitted in with the music so well. And again, he never hogged, or seemed to me to hog the limelight. He was just happy to make a perfect support for whoever he was playing with. And my God, did he play with anyone and everyone. Like I said, we saw him with Michel Petrucciani, Chris Husseinier, you saw him with Hiromi, of course, who we featured. I think we both saw him with Hiromi in London again at a later date as well. And, Flack, Chaka Khan, Diana Ross, Madonna, the Bee Gees. He played with the Bee Gees. I didn't know that, you see. Simon and Garfunkel, Luther Vandross. The list just goes on. Pat Metheny. I mean, basically, think of anyone who wanted a really first-rate bass player at some stage. Chances are Anthony Jackson would have been there. Like I said, quietly, you probably wouldn't notice, because whenever I saw him, I never ever remember him doing anything other than coming on quietly, picking up his bass, sitting down, playing. He never sort of did big flashy solos particularly. He never seemed to shout or ever talk or really look like a massive stage presence. And from what I gather, there was a little bit with Christian McBride I saw online who just said, yeah, he was like a father to me, and he sort of, Christian McBride's father played as well, and he said, I saw him, and he said, oh yeah, how's your dad getting on? And we used to have these deep conversations, and you think, yeah, just one of those great players who just got on with the music.
Indeed. Fleet-fingered, you say. He was also a long-time friend and compatriot and musician with Al Di Meola, featuring on his early albums, particularly notably for fleet-fingeredness, Elegant Gypsy. Dig it out. It's still worth a listen after all those years, and lots of glowing tributes to him from all of those musicians. Next up for me, Breath of Fresh Air, the second album from New York-based Grammy-nominated pianist Sean Mason. From it, here's the title track. No, it's not the title track. The first track, Rediscovery. rediscovery there from pianist Sean Mason and his quintet. New York is full of temptation for young musicians on the rise, with endless opportunities to lose oneself. As Sean says, after a gig, there were always people around wanting to buy you a drink. So to make this second album, Sean says he escaped the noise to save his sound and has moved out of New York, although the lineup is unchanged with his quintet, with Tony Glosey on trumpet, Chris Lewis on sax, Felix Moselman on bass and Domo Brank at the drums. The recording captures him in a different frame of mind, and A Breath of Fresh Air actually released today.
Oh, there's plenty of breaths of fresh air. Breaths of fresh air. On Jumpin In, all the best sounds in modern contemporary jazz. Do drop us a line anytime, of course. Howard Kane with an E at maxradio.com. Chris Kane with an E at maxradio.com. With any thoughts you've got, anything you'd like to hear, artists featured, or something that has come your way which you think is worthy of a play and a bit of a chat, it'd be lovely to do it. I mentioned earlier on Blue Note having a bit of a purple patch, and this is a new one which will be coming out in November from them. Another all-star Blue Note collective out of into their second studio album, featuring pianist Gerald Clayton, Emmanuel Wilkins on alto sax, vibes man Joel Ross, Kendrick Ross at the drums, and Matt Brewer on the bass. And that's coming out, or will be coming out on the 5th of December, in fact, at the back end of November or into December, after London Jazz. And this is the lead single. Check it out. Loving that fading off into the distance. Brothers in Arms, the lead single to Out of Into Motion 2, which, as the name suggests, is the second album from the group Out of Into. Gerald Clayton, Emmanuel Wilkins, Joel Ross, Kendrick Scott, Matt Brewer as well. Whole album will be out on the 5th of December. A cracking sound. Again, sort of reminds me in places of Walter Smith III and with some of his bands as well. I think has that sort of feel about it. Joel Ross vibes, I think, common to the two on some of them, and a cracking sound in that as well. Obviously, Blue Note celebrating 85 years, and really, I think, as I said, hitting a really great patch at the moment, and a whole load of music taken from the recording session that took place in the midst of the group's anniversary tour. And it'd be a nice band to see live, it has to be said. Such a long time on the road, it's really nice to get as far as possible and do a studio album, says Wilkins. And we really like to reach further and dig deeper night after night. And often you hear a studio album really reflects that if they've been on the road for some time. Downbeat says, great sounds, new dimensions of post-bop, sumptuous melodies, muscular improvisation and dynamic musicality. Well, I'm not going to disagree with that.
You can't say more than that, can you? And very fine it is too. Look out for that one. Well, we've just about got time to fit in a track from a musician who was so revered in his homeland of Germany that received a personal tribute when he passed away last week from the head of state. That doesn't happen very often, does it? Klaus Doldinger, who died aged 89, played in many, many jazz bands as a young saxophonist, winning the Sidney Bechet Prize in the 1962 Brussels Jazz Festival for saxophone. He wrote orchestral music, numerous film and TV scores, probably those best known in this country being The Never-Ending Story and Das Boot, before forming his jazz rock ensemble Passport in 1971, and together with them making some 30-plus albums. The group included over its years people like Philip Catherine, Brian Auger and many other great names. From their fourth album, Looking Through, here's the title track, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Until now, bye for now.
Yep, don't forget, it's Sweet and Swing next week, and we'll see you the week after that.